Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today we're looking at the first battle in the historical record that we have good detailed records of. Thutmose III's victory over the Canaanites at the Battle of Megiddo in around 1457 BCE. Now Thutmose III, as you might have guessed from his name, was another Egyptian pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty. So far, so good. So before we get into the immediate background and context of the battle, let's take a look at the last half century or so in Egypt. Thutmose I, who you'll remember from his victory over the Nubians at Kerma, campaigned up into the Levant later in his reign. Doesn't look like he was really interested in conquest like he was in Nubia. He just marched up the coast, torched a few cities, accepted some tribute, hunted elephants in Syria, and then went home. And then the Nubians rebelled again, so he sailed up the Nile to spank them again. This time he went all the way up the river past the Fourth Cataract. It's possible he went even further than that, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence left of it. But in about 1493 BCE, Thutmose I took his last ship up to the great river in the sky to be replaced by his son Thutmose II. Thutmose II's reign seems to have been fairly uneventful. The Nubians revolted when he took the throne, establishing what would apparently become a pattern for later pharaohs. So one of his first acts was to sail up the river and kick the rebels' asses. It looks like he fought another war against a Bedouin tribe in the Sinai, and then he may have headed north to campaign in Syria just like his father had. It's possible the Bedouin in the Sinai were just in his way as he headed up toward the Levant. Thutmose II ruled until 1480 BCE or so, when he died and his son Thutmose III took over as pharaoh. Which brings us more or less to the lead up to today's battle. Just like Ahmose I, if you remember back to the siege of Avaris, Thutmose III was underage when he took the throne. So his stepmother Hatshepsut, who you might have heard of, served as regent and then co-ruler with him. And just like Ahmose's mother Ahotep, Hatshepsut had no intention of playing second fiddle to anybody. She took the title pharaoh after Thutmose II's death, and when Thutmose III came of age, she named him commander of her armies. And that was just fine with Thutmose, at least for a while, because while there have been lots of people who believed, or at least claimed, that they were born warriors or soldiers, Thutmose III was one of those rare individuals who actually was. So let's talk about him for a minute. I've seen lots of different dates for when Thutmose III was born and how old he was when he and Hatshepsut became co-rulers. He might have been an infant, or 3, or 8, or 10. I've seen all of those. But he was a kid, and Hatshepsut seems to have been happy to have him around, as long as he didn't interfere with her rule in Egypt. And she seems to have done a pretty good job of it. She didn't start any wars, but it looks like she made some important improvements to the army, possibly developing a professional officer corps, possibly streamlining the army's logistical practices and organization. And she was a builder. Among many other projects, she started the Temple of Karnak, one of Egypt's most famous temples. This is where Thutmose would publish the records of his battles. If not for her, we might not know about him. So what do we know about him? Well, at least one scholar calls him the Egyptian Napoleon, because not only did he spend much of his reign campaigning, mostly in Canaan and Syria, but he also established military doctrines and practices that would guide Egypt for centuries. And not only was he a soldier, he was also a scholar, patronizing Egyptian artists, historians, and scientists. He apparently brought scribes with him on campaign whose job was to describe and catalog any unusual plants or animals they encountered, and presumably people too. He also changed the way Egypt thought of itself. For its entire history, Egypt had thought of itself as the center of the world, and any interaction with other cultures outside its borders was limited to strictly necessary functions like trade or war. But Thutmose showed his people that if they wanted to keep their kingdom secure, they needed to seek contact, to try to influence what happened in those outside kingdoms and guide it in Egypt's favor. And he formed his army into a professional force. He followed Hatshepsut's example in developing professional officer and non-commissioned officer corps, so his leaders would know what to do if their leaders weren't there to guide him. He expanded his draft so 1 out of every 10 young men would be enlisted into the army instead of 1 out of every 100 as it had been before. He built supply and garrison towns in the Nile Delta to simplify the logistics of marching north into the Levant, which he clearly foresaw as something he and his successors would have to do quite a bit of in the years ahead. He also built the first professional navy in the Mediterranean, because if he was going to have to spend a lot of time in the Levant, it made sense not to have to walk 300 miles up the coast every time he went up there. With a robust navy and several well-equipped ports on the coasts of Canaan and Lebanon, he could drop his army into pretty much any situation before the enemy knew he was coming. He may have been the first ruler in the world to build the capacity for surprise into his doctrine and infrastructure like this. But surprise, as we're going to see, was one of his favorite principles. But most of that stuff was still in the future in 1458 BCE when he took over as sole pharaoh from Hatshepsut. We think he was around 21 or 22 when it happened, and it's not clear whether she died or stepped down or he got sick of playing second fiddle and got rid of her. But however it happened, she was out of the picture. Whatever happened now was his problem. And the kings of Canaan came up with a problem for him pretty quick. You might remember from the episode on the siege of Kerma how the Nubians revolted just as soon as they got the word that Amenhotep I was dead. That's why Thutmose I had to spend the first year of his reign putting a boot in their asses. Well, that seems to have been a pretty standard practice in the late Bronze Age because that's just what the Canaanites did when they heard Hatshepsut was out. Makes sense if you think about it. When rule is absolute and succession is hereditary, you never really know what you're going to get when a new ruler comes in. So if you think you might want to take a crack at independence, you want to do it early in the new guy's reign while things are maybe still a little bit confused. Unfortunately for them, Thutmose III wasn't confused at all. So what's the big deal about Canaan, and why do the Egyptian pharaohs keep having to go up there? Well, Canaan was a collection of city-states that sat pretty much where Israel and Palestine sit today. And it was the crossroads of the ancient Near East. Any traffic coming by sea from the Mediterranean comes through there, as well as any traffic coming down toward Egypt from Mesopotamia or from Anatolia, or any traffic coming from Egypt up into Mesopotamia or Anatolia. In other words, in order for the 3 wealthiest regions in that part of the world to trade with each other, they had to go through Canaan. A single hostile town in that region could snarl up all kinds of things for Egypt. And when you're in a situation like that, you can either make sure the folks who live at the crossroads are happy to keep doing business with you, or you can make sure you have control over them. Egypt chose door number 2, which meant they had to deal with the occasional rebellion like this one. So several of the kings of Canaan, led by the kings of Kadesh and Megiddo, revolted against Egyptian rule just to see whether they could get away with it. If they'd drawn a pharaoh like Amenhotep I or Thutmose II, they figured this thing might go in their favor. If they got a scrapper like Ahmose I or Thutmose I, well, they could always just apologize and stay in power. So the king of Kadesh, whose name may have been Darusha, invited the other kings of Canaan to join him in a revolt. He may have had a puppet master egging him on, the king of the Mitanni, a large kingdom on the upper Euphrates that was competing with the Hittites to be the big dog in the Levant, or the other big dog, the one that wasn't Egypt. Several of the Canaanite kings thought that sounded like a good idea, including the king of a town called Megiddo. Now, Megiddo was pretty key to Darusha's concept here because the city sits on a hill overlooking a broad plain that any trade passing through the area has to cross. And it controls the routes from that plain through the Carmel Mountains that lead to the coast road to Egypt. In other words, any trade from Mesopotamia to Egypt had to pass Megiddo. And a broad plain like the one below Megiddo is perfect for maneuvering a chariot army. And more importantly for Darusha, Megiddo was between Egypt and Kadesh. Darusha could fight the Egyptians there without risking his own city. Probably. So the Canaanites put together an army of 10 or 15,000 and assembled at Megiddo to wait for the Egyptians. But it looks like Thutmose III was cut from a different cloth entirely from what the Canaanite kings and even the Mitanni were expecting. Because as soon as Thutmose learned of the revolt, he mustered his army and marched. No shit, there they were. Here's where the improvements Hatshepsut and Thutmose had made to the army and to their military logistics really started to pay off. Because Thutmose didn't have to levy troops and wait for them to assemble, and he didn't have to spend any time training or testing his leaders to make sure they knew what they were doing. He called his generals, he said, "Let's go," and they formed up their guys with all their shit and they went. They marched somewhere between 10 and 20,000 guys and 1,000 chariots from Egypt to Gaza in 10 days, a respectable pace, especially for a force that size. Past Gaza, security became more important. If Darusha knew exactly what was coming at him and exactly where it was and how it would travel to get to him, his job would get a lot easier. Because not only were there a limited number of roads to get from the coast road to the city, but the coast road itself ran through a broad coastal plain, perfect for the Canaanite chariots to attack Thutmose's army on the march. Because remember, chariots are at their best when they can attack infantry marching or fleeing. If the infantry has time to form up into proper lines of battle, the chariots lose a lot of their advantage. So if you know you're going to face chariots, you want it to be at a time and place of your choosing, not theirs. And you want a chance to get your guys ready before they charge. Thutmose marched his army 80 miles from Gaza in 9 days to avoid that surprise attack. His next stop was the city of Yaham, which controlled the road junction from the east road across the Carmel Mountains to Megiddo. From there, Thutmose had 3 options. The southern route would dump him out above the town of Tanakh, 4 or 5 miles south of Megiddo. The central route came out of the mountains within a mile or so of the city, and the northern route would take him past the town of Jephte, 4 or 5 miles north of Megiddo. Thutmose's scouts discovered that the southern and the central routes were both guarded by chariot forces that would be able to maneuver against the Egyptians as they were coming out of the mountains. Suboptimal. Now pay attention, because Thutmose is about to win this battle before he even forms up his lines. So a mountain pass is what's known as a defile. It's a narrow space that restricts your ability to maneuver, a choke point, if you will. An ancient army, any army really, needs to be able to spread out. In general terms, you want to be able to point as many spears and shields or rifles or whatever at your enemy as you can. A defile restricts your ability to do that. If your enemy decides to hit you while you're passing through, a relatively much smaller force can block a relatively much larger force, because the defile limits the number of spears you can point at your enemy. That's what allowed the Spartans to hold off the Persian army at Thermopylae, if you're familiar with the 300 story. They fought from inside a narrow pass, which limited the number of guys the Persians could send at them at one time. We'll do that one soon, and we're going to talk about how it works. And even if your enemy waits to hit you until you're coming out of the defile, they still have an advantage because you need time and space to get units out and organized into your line of battle. A unit can get bottled up inside a defile and torn to pieces. The guys coming out are outnumbered and disorganized and easy pickings for any enemy waiting for them. And the guys still inside are pushing forward to get out and help their buddies, which means the guys already outside have nowhere to retreat to except into the enemy. It can get ugly quick, and the way to deal with it is to make sure you have good security in the defile to keep from being surprised, and to get through the defile as fast as possible to keep from getting bottled up. Or you can find a different route. Thutmose spent 3 days at Yaham collecting intelligence about his enemy. Then he picked the center route. Now we just established that the center route was covered by a chariot force, so maybe it wasn't the best option. We also said the northern route was uncovered, so maybe that one would have been better. Except the northern route was the longest one, and it would be pretty easy for the Canaanites to reposition to cover it if they learned the Egyptians were coming that way. But Thutmose understood something about warfare that Darusha didn't count on. He knew that if your enemy offers you 3 options to get at him, you should take option 4. What does that mean? It means you should do what your enemy doesn't expect you to do. If there's a route they've left uncovered because only an idiot would go that way, you need to consider whether that's the way to go. In this case, there was a side trail off the center route, not much more than a creek bed that the Canaanites had left uncovered. Taking that route would let the Egyptians come out of the mountains a mile from Megiddo, with no enemy army in the way. There was just one problem. It was so narrow they would have to go single file. In fact, it was so narrow they were going to have to take their chariots apart and carry them, leading the horses in single file to get through, and then put the chariots back together before they would be useful on the other side. It wasn't a defile, it was more like a hallway. How long do you think it takes to get 10,000 men through a 5-mile hallway? And how long after they get through it is it going to take to get the chariots put back together and the horses hooked up? I don't know either. But if there's even a token force watching the exit of that creek bed, you're pretty well fucked. But only an idiot would go that way, so the Canaanites had left it unguarded. And Thutmose not only sent his army that way, he led them that way. It was a pattern he would follow for pretty much every campaign. If he asked his guys to do something dangerous, he would be right there with them. And this is a great example of a quality great field commanders have that I've never been able to distill down into just a word or two. This ability to make a decision, take a calculated risk, and have it work out in their favor. Luck is part of it, and tenacity, and the ability to identify the opportunity in the risk. Hell, part of it's just survivorship bias, right? The gamble worked out for them, and that's why we're talking about them. But whatever you call it, most generals, even in ancient times, wouldn't have put their own asses on the line in case their decision didn't work out. Props to Thutmose for leading from the front. Well, you already know how it worked out because we're talking about how great he was. They got through the creek bed and there was no enemy there. When Thutmose cleared the end of the defile and looked across at the city, his rear elements were still back in camp. But by the end of the day, they were all through the mountains. They camped that night where they were, and before first light, Thutmose moved his units into their attack formations. And when the Canaanites stepped out of their tents to take a piss in the morning, well, let's just say they maybe did more than just piss. Because there was the Egyptian army formed up and ready for battle. And here's where another element worked in Thutmose's favor. Because Darusha was supposedly the overall Canaanite commander, but his forces were cobbled together from lots of different city-states, not all of whom probably liked each other, and not all of whom agreed on what they should do. So when the Egyptian army just showed up out of nowhere, most of them probably followed his orders to form up, but he was already on thin ice. Whatever plan he had, whatever he had told them, he had just lost their confidence. So when the Egyptians started their attack, the Canaanite army just melted. The chariots met briefly in the center of the battlefield, but when the infantry started forward to close the gap, the Canaanites decided they had had enough. Part of the force, presumably the king of Megiddo and a few key allies, hauled ass toward the city where the people let down ropes made out of clothes knotted together to pull them over the wall. The rest of the Canaanites, including Darusha and the forces he had brought from Kadesh, just left, taking whatever was left of their armies back to their own cities. And the Egyptian army also showed that maybe it wasn't quite as professional as Thutmose wanted it to be, because the Egyptian soldiers started forward in pursuit of the fleeing Canaanites. But when they got to the Canaanite camp, they couldn't stop themselves. They stopped to loot it. That's probably what allowed the army of Megiddo to reach the city and get inside. So instead of destroying the Canaanite army and then turning his attention on the city, Thutmose had to settle in for a siege. And just like everything else he did, he went all in. He had his guys dig a ditch all the way around the city and put up a palisade. Nobody was getting in or out of this motherfucker unless Thutmose invited them. And sometime later, I've seen a month and I've seen 7 months, so it was somewhere in that range, the city surrendered and the siege ended. But Thutmose didn't sack the city. Instead, it looks like he worked out a negotiated surrender of some kind. He took some prisoners and some tribute, and he took hostages from among the city's noble families, and probably from the families of any kings other than Megiddo who were still in the city. Now, hostages are an interesting concept. The idea is similar to the way we talk about hostages today, human shields who will be killed if somebody doesn't do what you want. But these kind of hostages serve another purpose as well. Because when you take a king's son as a hostage, you have a pretty good guarantee that the king's going to behave the way you want him to. And you can also raise the kid as an Egyptian. Teach him the language and customs and finer points of Egyptian life so that when he goes home as an adult, he'll think of himself as an Egyptian. So you get a guarantee against the first king's behavior, and you might not need one against his son's behavior. Because in spite of what you read in fantasy novels about undying oaths and young men who remember their broken father's dying wishes, it's actually pretty unusual for a kid who's taken from his family at a young age to preserve or even remember his family's customs. Especially if the people he lives among, who will become his new family for all intents and purposes, are actively trying to get him to embrace their ways. These kids would have been thoroughly Egyptianized by the time they went home, probably 10 years or more after they left. And they would have gone home to prominent positions, kings or governors or high-level ministers. Unless, of course, their fathers revolted, then they would have been dead. So Thutmose had settled the situation with Megiddo. But it wasn't the last time he led a military campaign into the Levant. No, in the next 20 years, he would lead at least 15 more campaigns into Canaan and Syria, and possibly another one into Nubia. Unfortunately, all we have of those campaigns are very general descriptions, so this is probably the last time we're going to see Thutmose III. So we'll run through his other campaigns real quickly. His next 3 campaigns looked like they were mostly just tribute collecting tours. Campaigns 5, 6, and 7, he conquered Syria. It looks like he built harbors on the coast in the 5th campaign, then used those to move troops directly to the spots he wanted to hit in the 6th and 7th. He finally pillaged Kadesh on one of these campaigns. Yeah, suck it, Darusha. His 8th campaign was an interesting one I wish we had records of so we could do an episode on it. On this campaign, he apparently sailed to the Syrian coast, then portaged his boats to the Euphrates River so he could conduct the world's first amphibious invasion when he crossed the river to conquer Mitanni. The Mitanni, totally surprised by his bold invasion, barely put up a fight before they surrendered. Campaigns 9 through 16 were mostly for collecting tribute. Obviously, he's already conquered everybody. He did some fighting on a few of these, but the records are so fragmentary that we don't know much about him. And then campaign 17 was the one into Nubia. It looks like he went up to the 4th cataract, so maybe not quite as far as Thutmose I when he destroyed Kerma. Including his time as co-ruler with Hatshepsut, Thutmose III ruled Egypt for something like 54 years. He died around 1425 BCE, and the empire he left was much different from the one he inherited. So now let's take a look at how Thutmose did at Megiddo. A reminder, each principle is graded on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. First one is mass, your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. Thutmose was damn near perfect here. He managed to move his army unseen onto the battlefield, so by the time he was in position to attack, it didn't take much pressure to send his enemy screaming home. It didn't hurt him that the Canaanites were disunified and don't seem to have trusted each other very much. So Thutmose gets a 5. And Darusha gets a 1. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. If you read the records Thutmose left, which are the only records we have, he was in control of the situation from the day his army left Egypt. It doesn't look like the Canaanites even tried to attack him until he reached Megiddo, or even really to find him. So, once again, Thutmose gets a 5, and Darusha gets a 1. Surprise! Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. This was pretty much Thutmose's whole plan. I'm not sure the Canaanites really even expected him to show up. There's a pattern developing here. Thutmose gets a 5. Darusha gets a 1. Security. Keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. Everything Thutmose did before he sent his troops through the creek bed was focused on this. Moving quickly from Egypt to Gaza, then hurrying along the coast road from Gaza to Yaham, were all moves designed to limit the amount of time his army spent strung out and exposed to ambush. Taking the creek bed was a calculated risk, but if there had been Canaanite troops blocking it, it would have gone hard for the Egyptians. The Canaanites, for their part, had troops watching the exits to the passes, but other than that, they might have been there for a fair or something. So Thutmose is going to get a 4 here, and Darusha gets a 2. Maneuver. Your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. The Egyptians probably could have attacked through the main passes and still overwhelmed the Canaanites. But by attacking from an unexpected direction, Thutmose all but guaranteed his victory. The Canaanites seem to have just trusted their choke points to do the work for him. So Thutmose gets a 5, and Darusha gets a 2. Objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. It looks like Thutmose thought the objective was to destroy Darusha's army and then take the city. And it looks like his troops weren't entirely on board with that. Given a chance to enrich themselves, they forgot all about the enemy. Of course, it's not clear the Canaanites were there to fight at all. So Thutmose gets a 2, and Darusha gets a 1. Unity of command. Every soldier on the battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. The Egyptians were clearly following Thutmose, even though they forgot to follow orders for a little while. The Canaanite tribes seem to have been following their own leaders, but in spite of Darusha's claim to have brought everybody together, nobody was in charge overall. So Thutmose is going to get a 4 here, and Darusha gets a 1. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. Thutmose's approach to the battlefield was not simple. We didn't talk about this in the narrative, but his own generals recommended he not take the creek bed. But by the time he got to the battlefield, he didn't need a complicated plan. It's not clear Darusha had a plan at all except to stop the Egyptians from crossing the mountains. So Thutmose gets a 3 here, and Darusha gets a 1. Finally, economy of force. This is your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. Thutmose was all in every step of the way. If he had not been facing an incompetent adversary, his aggressiveness might have cost him. But because the Canaanites don't seem to have had much interest in fighting, it was the right way to approach this fight. So on this one, they both get a 3. And for our totals, Thutmose gets a 36 out of 45. And Darusha gets a 13 out of 45. So Thutmose has one of the highest scores we've seen so far, and Darusha has one of the lowest. This is at least partly because the only record we have of Megiddo is the one Thutmose commissioned. It's likely the actual event was less lopsided than he presents it. Surely Darusha did something right. But we have to go with the information we have. So Thutmose was damn near perfect, and Darusha looks completely incompetent. So that's the Battle of Megiddo. If you enjoyed this war story, please send me a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.